Hey guys, so I just wanted to run through this PowerPoint that we have today on cell structure. So this is our first day of looking at cell structure. Just a reminder, we have talked about cells before, just very briefly. So it was one of our levels in the hierarchy of life that we looked at when completing our bean soup activity. It was also one of the levels, actually the lowest level, of that body organization hierarchy that we looked at. So we've had some foundational information about cells and at least how they fit into the hierarchy of life. So now we're going to be looking at cells in a little bit more depth. Okay, so what are cells? A cell is the smallest living unit of an organism and is the basic building block of all organisms. Notice that we stated here that they are living. So cells are the smallest living unit of an organism. So even though cells make up an organism that is living, cells in themselves are living. So thinking back to some of the characteristics that we talked about of living organisms, they have DNA, they need to be able to reproduce, they are able to respond to stimuli, maintain homeostasis, and even more. So those are just some of the characteristics that I had on the top of my head. But cells are able to do all of these, which makes them so important in this distinction between non-living organisms and living organisms. So non-living organisms do not have cells. They're made of atoms and molecules, but they do not have these living structures called cells. Living organisms, on the other hand, do. So yes, they're made of atoms and molecules, but these atoms and molecules come together to form these living, functioning structures called cells. So something to point out is that living things can be composed of either one cell, which would make them unicellular, or many cells, so multicellular. And then I have an image here of a brick wall. Reason being because a brick is the building block or most basic unit of a brick wall, and that's kind of how cells are for living organisms. They are that basic building block in the overall organism. So let's look at this real quickly in the terms of humans. So our bodies themselves are made up of many kinds of cells, which we talked about when looking at that body organization hierarchy. So remember, we're made of cells. We have many of the same type of cell that comes together to form a tissue. And then we have many tissues that come together to form an organ. Many organs come together to form an organ system. And then many organ systems come together to form an actual organism. So our bodies are made up of many kinds of cells, and each of these are specialized for a specific purpose. We will actually talk more about this specialization later when we look at cell differentiation. So some examples of these different kinds of cells. We have epithelial cells. So thinking of our skin, it protects the surface of our body. And then all of our organs and body cavities actually have epithelial cells that cover them. Now we have other types of cells, and another example is for the immune system. Over here I have a picture of a helper T cell, which is an immune cell that helps fight invading bacteria. Okay, so how were cells discovered? So who discovered cells? It was English scientist Robert Hooke in 1665, and this is a replica of the microscope that he actually created. Using this microscope, he was able to look at little cork cells. So for those who don't know, a cork is actually made of the bark of a cork oak tree. So using this microscope, he was able to look at the dead cells of that oak bark. What he noticed when looking at those was repeated little geometric boxes that were in these structures that he ended up calling cells. Now his microscope wasn't good enough to be able to see all the organelles that we'll be talking about today, but this was the initial discovery of a cell. So this discovery, plus those to follow, originated this theory called cell theory. So cell theory is a scientific theory that all living organisms are made of cells as the smallest fundamental unit. The three important principles that have arose from this theory is all living things are composed of one or more cells. The cell is the basic unit of life, and all new cells arise from existing cells, not from spontaneous generation. So back in the day, it was believed, in terms of spontaneous generation, that living organisms could arise from non-living matter. But through some experiments, one specifically looking at maggots and meat, actually allowed scientists to discover that living things can't just generate from non-living matter. Instead, everything arises from an existing cell. And we will actually talk more about that concept when we start getting into genetics. Okay, so overall there are two types of cells. They are prokaryotic cells, like below, and eukaryotic cells, like below. So all cells, whether they're eukaryotic or prokaryotic, have some common features, and actually these can be seen on the diagram as well, but they include a plasma membrane, cytoplasm, DNA, and ribosomes. Now in this image you'll also see talk of a nucleus and a nucleoid region. So the main concept to take from here is that we have localized centers for our DNA, but only eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. Prokaryotic cells, it's a bit more messy, but it's kind of formed together in the central section that we refer to as a nucleoid. So looking at prokaryotic cells, the prokaryotic cell that we will focus mostly on is bacteria, but it can be partitioned into two different types of cells, the archaea and bacteria cells. Archaea cells are actually known as one of the first living organisms, actually the first living organism, and we can find evidence of them in our fossil records as far back as about 3 billion years ago. Not that we need to know a whole lot about archaea right now, but in case you're curious, archaea tend to be extremophiles. So they're able to withstand wide environmental tolerance of things like temperature, salinity, and even radioactivity, which causes them to be found in some very obscure places like hydrothermal vents, the Dead Sea, which has a very high salinity, and places like oil wells, and so on. So overall, prokaryotes are smaller and less complex. They're unicellular, so they're made out of one cell. like shown, just one single cell. There's no nucleus. Remember we said before that their DNA is formed in a nucleotide, but not a nucleus. And there are no membrane-bound organelles. Okay, in comparison, eukaryotes, which are found in plants, animals, fungi, and protists, we'll be looking mostly at, obviously, plants and animals, are larger and more complex. They can be unicellular, but also multicellular. They have a nucleus, which we can see on these diagrams where the nucleus is, a big central organelle, and has membrane-bound organelles, which we'll be looking at a little bit deeper in a second. So what are cell organelles? They're specialized parts of the cell that have different functions to perform. So all of these organelles, and we can see them actually labeled in this diagram below, all have specific roles and functions within the cell as a whole. And in order for the cell to stay alive and perform its function within the body, each of these organelles needs to be able to perform their duty or function. So what we're going to do with this next part is that I have a lot of the major organelles listed off for you guys to go through and explore. So I want you to go through, first skim, what type of organelles are we going to be talking about? Read the descriptions that I gave, and then I want you to use the 2 links that I provided in the cell notes, like cell structure notes folder, to actually find the function for each of these organelles. Once you're done, you're going to go back into like the cell structure notes folder in our Tuesday folder, and I have this completed slideshow. So the one that I've been showing you right now in this video, you're going to open that up and actually compare. So see, using those links, did you write down the correct functions or did you not? So all of this is going to give us a little bit of experience looking through and getting to know each of these organelles. Okay, best of luck with the activity and let me know if you have any questions.